Let's talk about the life of Socrates first. Socrates died in 399 BC, and he was born approximately 70 years before that, although there's some controversy about the exact year of his birth. His father was a stonecutter or sculptor or mason, the descriptions vary, named Socrates, and his mother was a midwife, according to Socrates, and her name was Phaenarete. Now, there might be something a little fishy about the story of his mother, because Phaenarete means one who brings excellence to light. And as a midwife, she brought children to light, and Socrates claims that as the son of a midwife, his purpose is to bring ideas to birth. And so the son of the person who brings excellence to light brings ideas to light, and some people have perhaps thought that Socrates sort of just made up his mother's name or profession for the purposes of the discussion, but that's purely suppositional. Anyway, he was not a poor man, by birth at least. His father was a citizen of Athens, and Socrates himself was a soldier. He was a member of the heavy infantry, a hoplite. The Greeks did not have professional soldier classes, although they would hire sometimes mercenaries who were professionals. But the city-states like Athens had citizen armies, and the citizens played different roles in the army depending upon the amount that they could contribute. And the person who was part of the heavy infantry had to contribute a shield and a spear and helmet and armor, things like that. And these things were not cheap. So Socrates obviously had some money. The thing is, though, that he lived a life of poverty because he didn't like to work. He spent most of his time lounging around in public places, the marketplace or gymnasia, and talking about philosophy. His wife, whom he married rather late in life, was notoriously shrewish. Her name was Xanthippe. Somebody asked him, Socrates, why do you put up with this woman who's cursing you in public and demanding that you work and things like that? And he said, well, just as some riders will like only the most spirited horses because it forces them to exercise and gain their powers, maximize their skill, so I prefer to live with Xanthippe because she's a real trial, and she doesn't kill me, she just makes me stronger, is basically the argument. He had 3 children, all of them rather late in life. The day of his death, his children are described, and a couple of them are just tiny. So obviously his wife was many years younger than he was, and he was reproducing right up until a couple of years before his death. So it's clear that he had to have married fairly late in life, probably around age 50. We know very little about Socrates' life before he became an adult. But there are rumors that he did travel a bit, that he studied philosophy and science with various natural philosophers. And he does confess in one of Plato's dialogues, the Phaedo, which is set on the day of his death, to have taken a great interest in science or natural philosophy as a youth. And that by the time he entered middle age, though, he came to have a kind of crisis and thought that natural philosophy was really meaningless, that knowing, the nature of the stars and why it rained and so forth was all very well and good as a kind of academic or intellectual exercise. There was no sense of applied science at the time. Science was only a purely idle and speculative activity. And he actually claimed that studying science made him blind and made him forget the things that he already knew, specifically things about how men grew, how human beings grow over time, and that he became less intelligent in some ways than he was before he studied science. And so one of the things that happened in midlife is that Socrates put aside the natural sciences. He came to think that it was difficult, if not impossible, for human beings to get to ultimate truth about the cosmos. We could only, at best, tell likely stories, and that these likely stories were not that important unless they could contribute to our moral life. And he reoriented philosophy from a theoretical, speculative activity centered around nature to a more practical activity centered around human morality, human life. And the central question is a kind of existential question, which is, how should I live? What is the good life? And not just the good life in general, but for me, for each individual. We know a few other things about Socrates. He was notoriously unattractive. He was an ugly man. He looked like a satyr, or I have a statue here which is a representation of Socrates from about the time of his life. And he was notorious for having pop eyes, sort of bulging eyes, a flat pug nose, wide fleshy lips, and a pot belly. And so he did look like the classical Greek descriptions of satyrs, which were horny little mythical beings. But in spite of his ugliness, he was extremely charismatic, and people much younger and much handsomer than he was fell in love with him and were quite fascinated by Socrates. He was renowned for his feats of endurance. He served in 3 battles, and they were all defeats, as it turned out, for Athens, but he distinguished himself in these defeats. Anyway, he was especially good at retreating, it was turned out. But there's an art of retreating properly. If you flee headlong, the enemy will try and strike you down, whereas if you retreat in a composed way, casting your glance from side to side, making it clear that you've got your wits about you, people will leave you alone, and this is how Socrates retreated. He always had his wits about him. There's a description by Alcibiades of Socrates on one of these campaigns that appears in Plato's Symposium. And Socrates started thinking about a philosophical problem early one morning before most people got up. And he stood there in the camp. The ground was frozen. He walked around in bare feet all the time, except on special occasions. Snow was not a good enough occasion to put shoes on, apparently. The ground was frozen, it was cold, and he stood there before dawn, started thinking, and after a while people started stirring, and they started sitting around watching, wondering when he was going to stop this. And it turned out that he stood there the whole day, and all the next night, and then the next morning he said a prayer as the sun rose, and then went off to do his daily business. And this is an extraordinary feat, if it's true, and it shows a sign of enormous self-control. This is the kind of thing that you'd expect from a yogi who's long practiced in controlling the body's voluntary and involuntary muscles to a degree that most normal human beings simply can't contemplate. And this would explain, if he had some kind of long practice in this, why he had such endurance under difficult conditions, why he seemed to be so indifferent to heat and cold, why he spent all of his time outdoors. He was also notorious for being able to drink and drink and drink and never get drunk. You know, he could drink anybody under the table and never get drunk. So there are extraordinary features of the man that need to be explained somehow. Socrates, when he was in his 40s, became the butt of a play by Aristophanes called Clouds. This was premiered in 424 BC at one of the great Dionysia, which were these religious festivals, which included a theater festival, because the theater arose out of religious rites and was part of these festivals, and was put on. Theater festivals were put on at public expense. At the Greater Dionysia, there were 3 trilogies of tragedies that were presented, 3 satyr plays and 3 comedies, and there were contests to determine which were the best. The people who wrote the 3 tragedies also wrote a satyr play. So the tragedians had the heaviest labor. They had to write 4 plays for each thing. The comic playwrights only had to write 1 each. During this particular year, 2 of the 3 plays had Socrates as a central figure, and both were making fun of him. And The Clouds came in dead last. It was voted 3rd place out of 3. Aristophanes got the last laugh because of all the ancient comedies, only plays by Aristophanes survive. to this day. So history has rendered a different judgment about the value of the plays which beat him out. This is the earliest representation we have of Socrates, around 424 BC. All of Plato's dialogues were written after Socrates' death in 399 BC. Xenophon, who was another student and friend of Socrates, wrote a number of Socratic works, but all of these were written after Socrates' death as well. But The Clouds is the only work written during Socrates' life, and it's a very unflattering work. It portrays Socrates as a sophist and as a student of nature. And I need to say a little bit about the sophists and the natural philosophers to provide some background here. Natural philosophy for the ancient Greeks was basically what we would call science today. And the ancient Greek natural philosophers tried to give rational and materialistic explanations for virtually everything, including all the phenomena that had been traditionally accounted for by appeals to deities, gods, spirits, and so forth. And so the project of the natural philosophers was a project of disenchanting the world, of getting rid of ghosts and mystical spiritual powers and replacing them with mechanistic scientific explanations. And so there was a tendency for the natural philosophers to be branded as atheists. And there was some good reason for that. Most of them had no belief in any conventionally known divinities. If you sort of prodded them, they would say, well, the ultimate material stuff of the cosmos, be it water or air or fire, that's what we call the divine. But it's a notion of the divine that's entirely foreign to any traditional notion, and is distinct from traditional divinities in the fact that it doesn't have any intelligence, and even if it did have any intelligence, it doesn't care about human beings. Okay, so they make no difference to human beings, these gods of the natural philosophers. Now, one of the things that characterized the natural philosophers was a very strong and careful distinction that they would make between what was natural and what was conventional, what happens by nature and what happens by custom or convention. And the natural philosophers really were the people who introduced this distinction between nature and convention into human thinking. Before ancient Greek natural philosophy, there were notions of order that did not distinguish between natural order and humanly created order. So, for instance, in China, there's this notion of the Tao, the way of things, right? The way things have always been. There's a kind of descriptive quality. It's the way things have always been, but there's a kind of normative quality that goes along with the two, namely the way they've always been and the way they ought to be. And that would make perfect sense to talk about the Tao of ducks and geese or bears and the Tao of human cities and human institutions and so forth. There was no distinction between nature and culture. The Egyptians had this notion of Maat, which is sometimes translated as justice, but it really is, again, equivalent to this notion of Tao. It's just the immemorial way of things, the way they always have been, the way they ought to be, and it applies both to human actions and to natural actions and patterns or natural orders. There are a number of words in Hebrew that basically have this meaning, and they can be translated as the way of things. The same word for nature or natural things can also be, for instance, sometimes they talk about the way of women, which means menstruation, right? It can also be used to describe what we would call, say, the American way. How we do things around here, or how the Canaanites did things over there. But one process is natural, the other conventional, but the same concept denotes both. And the Greeks were that way too. They had a concept, nomos, which is sometimes translated as law, or custom. But for the early Greeks, it would refer to natural processes as well. So you could talk about the nomos of the stingray, or the nomos of geese, them flying back and forth, migrating, or the nomos of the Athenians, or the Spartans, or the Egyptians. The nomoi, is the plural. And there was no distinction made between nature and convention, yet nature and convention are clearly distinct. Nature is always the same, and the early natural philosophers believed that natural order was eternal and cyclical. It always repeated. Everything always happened the same way. And this was true over time and from place to place. For instance, geese north of the Rio Grande and south of the Rio Grande have the same patterns. They live the same way. But when you look at human beings north and south of the Rio Grande, they live in very different ways. Why is that? Why is there this enormous variability in human patterns of behavior from place to place? And you can also raise the question in terms of time. Why is there such an enormous variation in human behavior from one time to the next? 100 years ago in the United States, attitudes about dating and mating and things like that were very different from how they are today. And these transformations simply were not the kinds of things you'd expect in nature. So the early Greek natural philosophers really made thematic a distinction that had always been there, just waiting to be made, between how things are by nature and how things are by convention or culture. And since the natural philosophers tended to identify nature with what's good, they tended to look upon the world of convention with a certain amount of disdain. These things are ephemeral. They're variable. You can't bank on them. You can't count on them. We have to trust nature, which is eternal, immutable, and just rolls on in its cyclical patterns forever. What that tended to do is it tended to alienate the students of nature from the cities that they lived in. And it tended to lead them to regard ordinary people with a certain amount of patronizing cynicism. These poor blokes who believe all these silly conventions. And what came about as a consequence of natural philosophy was another school of thought known as the Sophists. And the Sophists were very worldly philosophers. They were rather uninterested in the nitty-gritty study of nature. The Sophists were not interested in debating theories about how the rain was made or how the thunder was made. But they did accept the basic worldview of the natural philosophers, that there's a difference between nature and convention, that nature is what's good and convention is pretty much worthless. But they were practical men, and so they asked themselves, what's the practical meaning of this discovery of the difference between the natural and the cultural? And the answer is this. Human beings, to be guided by nature, should be guided by their desires. Okay? Because those are the most natural things about us, they thought. And when it comes to satisfying our desires in society, well, that means that we need to understand the conventions of society. But since these conventions are worthless, we can be quite cavalier and flip and manipulative in their use in order to gratify ourselves. And so the Sophists taught a philosophy of getting ahead by means that were unscrupulous. They thought that morality was merely conventional. It was for suckers. So was religion. That the only thing natural were their desires and certain characteristics that you could say were psychological characteristics of human beings that could be manipulated in order to persuade them to gain power over them and so forth. And Socrates is shown in the Clouds as being both a natural philosopher and a sophist. Yet it's clear that by the end of his life he was neither. He was an enemy of both the natural philosophers and the sophists. He turned away from the study of nature because it made him blind, he said. Blind to how men grow and how they live. And he also turned away from mere rhetoric, mere manipulation, mere sophistry, towards a different conception of persuasion. And what underlies this turn is the discovery of a new concept, and that is the notion of what's right by nature. As soon as the distinction was made between nature and convention, morality was immediately put in the convention column, because morals differ from time to time and place to place, so they can't be natural. Nature doesn't really have a moral law. It just has the law of the struggle for survival, the struggle for dominance. It's an amoral realm, according to the early Greeks. So this licensed the behavior of the sophists, right, their amorality. What Socrates came to believe in is the existence of something that is right by nature, objective standards, if you will, of right. And what this did is this gave a foundation for a serious-minded pursuit of knowledge about what's right by nature, which reorients philosophy away from mere frivolous and theoretical concern with why the rain falls or the ultimate stuff of matter, and orients it towards the question, what's the good life for man? And this is the first question. There's the second page here is a list of theses, Socratic theses, that I would like to discuss throughout this course. And so this long story gets us to the first Socratic thesis, which is the primary philosophical question is, how should I live? It's a moral question. It's a question of ought, right? It's a question of the good. And it's also a very existential question in the sense that it's concerned with the individual. How should I live? There's a concrete concern here, which is something that Socrates, as he's portrayed in Aristophanes' Clouds, and something that the earlier Greek philosophers had simply had no sense of, an interest in concrete individual life. The sophists, of course, were interested, but the early philosophers weren't. Now, the second thesis is enormously important, and we'll have ample opportunity to discuss and debate this. Socrates believed that all human action aims at happiness or well-being. Now, happiness is the general translation, and I think it's the translation of Nichols. I've forgotten. I'm pretty sure it is. But the Greek word is eudaimonia. And what is eudaimonia? Well, eudaimonia is best translated, I think, as well-being. And the reason for that is this, and this is thesis 3, well-being is not necessarily well-feeling, if you will. There's a difference between feeling good and being good. And the difference is made clearest in this way. Well-being may require ill-feeling from time to time. Well, what does that mean? Well, let's give an example. If you come home and you discover that your beloved father, is dead. Okay. Now, if you were to feel good about that, that's not a sign of well-being. That's a sign of disorder, sickness in the soul. Because there's certain things in the world that you shouldn't feel good about. And if your soul is in a state of well-being or health, then in those circumstances where bad or negative feelings are required, those are the feelings you're going to have. So feeling bad is sometimes a sign of being good in a more fundamental way. And so there's a difference between happiness, understood as well-being, and simply feeling good. And we're going to go into this in much more detail later when we get to the discussion with Callicles and the Gorgias, because Callicles is a hedonist. He defines the good as the pleasurable. And Socrates has a whole battery of arguments that just crushes this thesis of hedonism. So we're going to be able to deal with this at greater length. The fourth thesis here is that wisdom and luck are the two causes of well-being. Now, he never states this as I've stated it in the dialogues, but there's reason to believe that this is his viewpoint, and I can show you how I can tease this out in the Euthydemus reading. What is wisdom? Well, wisdom for Plato is this. It's the ability to make right use of all things. And this definition has two very important components, the notion of right use and the notion of all things. Wisdom is not simply the ability to use things. That is what Plato calls art, or techne. The ability to use things, to manipulate things, to get things done, to use tools, for instance, to build things, to change things. This is what art is. Every art, every craft is an ability to transform the world in some way. Yet, no art and no craft is wisdom. Why is that? Because there's a difference between use and right use. And one of Plato's views is this, that the ability to use something does not automatically confer the ability to use it rightly. You can be terribly proficient in some technical activity or another. You can be an excellent surgeon, right? But that doesn't necessarily mean that you have the skills to use your abilities rightly. The skills do not apply themselves. They need to be applied. And the knowledge that gives you the ability to apply those things rightly is what he means by wisdom. Now, what about extremely comprehensive kinds of ability? Plato talks about different kinds of arts and how they can be hierarchically arranged. So, for instance, there's certain kinds of arts that are very basic, and others he calls architectonic. And what is an architectonic art? Well, it's an art that supervises many other sub-arts. So, for instance, the art of politics is a kind of architectonic art because what it does is it supervises all the arts and all the crafts in the city. Right? Politicians can outlaw certain things, regulate certain things. They can affect orderings and prioritizings of all the different professions, arts, crafts that exist. And so there's a kind of controlling art there. And is this the same as wisdom? No. Even the ability to use a lot of things is not the same as the ability to use a lot of things or all things rightly. And as you well know, politicians, even extremely powerful politicians, in fact, primarily extremely powerful politicians, are often plagued by moral problems. Stalin is a good example. Stalin certainly possessed the architectonic art. He controlled all aspects of life for a vast number of people, yet that comprehensive technical skill that he could exercise did not necessarily lead him to act rightly. In fact, it gave him the ability to act wrongly on a colossal scale. So, wisdom is necessarily involved with the notion of right use. The rightness is intrinsic to it. If you take away the right, you don't have wisdom. And this is why, for Plato, moral philosophy is central, because the very notion of wisdom that he has an intrinsically moral component. Wisdom can't be wisdom without knowledge of the right or the good. Now, the notion of all things indicates that there's a kind of comprehensiveness here. What would a contrast be to the notion of right use of all things? Well, how about the right use of some things? For instance, the difference between a mere technical skill and what we would call a profession today is that the professions come with a kind of moral mission built into them. If you become a doctor or a lawyer or a minister or a teacher, the assumption is that there are certain ethical canons that guide your activity and make sure that the skills that you have are used to produce a good end. A doctor, or let's put it this way, a surgeon isn't just a person who cuts open bodies and sews them up. A torturer can do the same thing. What differentiates the surgeon from the torturer is not the skill, the simple physical manipulation of flesh, but it's the end to which those skills are directed. All the professions have built into them an orientation towards the good. By becoming a duly constituted doctor or lawyer, you are taking on a certain component of moral wisdom as part of your job description. That's the idea, at least. Lawyers are, of course, greatly relieved to hear this speech. And doctors, too, because oftentimes they wonder about themselves. The fact is that there's a reason why, for instance, that there's a traditional kind of prestige associated with the professions that is not associated, say, with simply being a business person. Why is that? Because the skills of business managers and salesmen and people like that are purely technical skills. There's nothing about the job description of being a businessman or a salesman or a manager that implies that by being a good businessman or salesman or manager, you're being a good person or doing good in a larger sense. You can be a very good businessman selling crap, shoddy products. The people who run Time Warner, they're very good businessmen, but they put out a lot of crappy stuff that, and if you tote it up overall, the effects that they have on the world are probably negative. The people who, make violent video games and movies that desensitize people to violence, things like that. These people can be very good businessmen and make lots of money, but they're not necessarily doing anything good. Whereas a profession has an intrinsic directedness to the good. But to be a professional is not to be a wise person, because there's a narrowness about professional ethics. And this is one thing that I found very interesting, watching a debate that was done when they were going to separate the Lakeburg Siamese twins. This might have been a decade ago now. These little Siamese twin girls were born, I think, in Philadelphia. And on Nightline, there was a discussion of the operation, the procedure that would separate them. And they had the surgeon, who was a very skilled surgeon, and clearly an ethical individual. And he was on there, and they had some medical ethicists and people like that, and my mother was calling me up, volunteering her opinion too. And it was very interesting because my mother knows nothing about surgery, but she had just as articulate an opinion about the larger moral issues raised by this as the doctor himself. Right. And there are certain circumstances where a person just simply armed with their set of professional ethics, their professional ethics, will encounter larger questions that they can't really deal with, right? And just as a professional, and they find themselves calling upon moral philosophers, or my mom, or pundits and newspaper columnists for guidance. Now, the surgeon wanted to do no harm. And in normal circumstances, he didn't have to. But in this circumstance, his professional ethics were sort of flummoxed, and he was just as at sea as everybody else talking about this, and there was a lot of debate. It was very interesting. Wisdom has a kind of comprehensive quality or comprehensive capacity to make right use of things, whereas the ethics of a profession is very delimited, and oftentimes you'll find extraordinary circumstances where ethical, well-meaning professionals simply can't decide the matter, and they go and ask other people. They go ask philosophers. And the assumption is that there is a kind of knowledge of right use that's more comprehensive. And this is what Plato means by wisdom in the most proper sense. It's a comprehensive knowledge of how to make use of everything rightly. Now, thesis number 6 is that wisdom is unconditionally and intrinsically good. All other things are merely conditionally and extrinsically good. What does that mean? Well, it's this. To be unconditionally and intrinsically good is to always be good in virtue of one's own nature. Whereas to be extrinsically and conditionally good is to be good only on the condition of being used rightly. And Plato's view is that nothing is intrinsically good or bad in this world except for wisdom. Everything else is either good or bad depending on the use to which it is put. And this is a sobering and strange thought when you start figuring it out, all the implications. It means, for instance, that many of the things that we would consider intrinsically good really aren't. When you ask people what are the components of a good life, people will say, well, ideally I'd like to be beautiful, rich, and famous. And the response is, well, there are lots of beautiful, rich, and famous people who are miserably unhappy. Well, why is that? Princess Diana was my favorite example. She still is. She was more than average in her attractiveness. She was certainly very rich, and she was very famous, and she was obviously very unhappy. And why was she so unhappy, given all the advantages that fate or luck had dealt her? Because she didn't have the ability to use those advantages well, to conduce to her own happiness. And she was spending huge amounts of money on psychics and colonic irrigation, trying to get it out of her by hook or by crook. The poor woman spent thousands and thousands of pounds on massage therapies and psychics and crystals and every pop New Age nonsense that you could possibly imagine to make herself happy. And what was she depending on? Well, she was looking for some kind of art or technique of happiness. And I was going to bring in a copy of Aquarius, the local New Age shopper type newspaper, which is very interesting, and it's just filled with ads. I read this once in class. I was flipping through this while I was teaching at Georgia State. And not only were there people offering you shiatsu and yoga classes, but they were saying that these are the keys to well-being, that there are certain technical skills that these people have, that if you learn them, you'll become a happy, self-actualized person. And this is the obsession of Americans. And it's not just the people who pick up the New Age newspapers. People who are going to therapy, people who are going on hikes, people are searching for happiness, and they go to professionals who claim to have certain technical skills that will lead them to happiness. But Plato's answer to that is simple. No technique, no art will lead you to happiness unless you've got the wisdom to use it rightly. And none of these things come with that built in. None of them are self-applying. They all need an external supplement, and that external supplement is knowledge of how to make right use of them, which is what philosophy pursues, wisdom. Now, folly is the opposite of wisdom. Okay, this is the point number 7. And folly may not be unconditionally bad. It might be the case that even folly can be conducive to happiness. There's a fellow who came to a couple of philosophy cafes. He was at the thing on Sunday, who told me that he had a terrible car accident. He was, had to have reconstructive surgery and things like this. And now he looks back on it and he says this was the best thing that ever happened to him. And I asked him when he said that, would you recommend it to other people? He said, no, I wouldn't recommend it, but it's the best thing that ever happened to him because it forced him to make changes in his life that made him end up being a much more happy person. So Plato gives us an account of happiness that would make perfect sense out of these strange alchemical transmutations of dross into gold, if you will, because many people do find that the things that are supposedly intrinsically good, like money or fame, are the worst things that ever happened to them. How many people have been ruined by winning lotteries? A book should be written about it. You hear all these stories, and a book should be written about it. By contrast, many people have been enormously benefited by losing a lot of money. People who have been cocooned all their life in wealth suddenly have had to face reality for the first time when they were broke and enjoyed the thrill of actually living for the first time. So in the things that convention says are intrinsically good are not intrinsically good. They're only good if they're used rightly. And the things by convention regarded intrinsically bad are not intrinsically bad. They're only bad if they're not used rightly. Even being a fool can be manipulated properly and be used to your benefit. And what's the clearest example of that? Well, learning from your folly. You blunder foolishly into a mistake, and if you can take that folly and, if you will, wisely use it, you can come out a much wiser person. William Blake, talked about this. How we are saved by our sins and follies, but only if you use them rightly. Number 8, we've already talked about. Wisdom is not an art or technique. No technique is sufficient for the pursuit of happiness. That doesn't mean that techniques are entirely useless, but they're not sufficient. They require the supplement of the wisdom to use them properly. The 9th point is that wisdom enlarges the realm of human power and efficacy, pushing back the frontiers of luck. Again, there are 2 causes of well-being, luck and wisdom. Plato recognizes that luck is an irreducible component in happiness. You can never entirely master it. You can be the best person in the world. You can be the most together person, the most decent, the most moral, the most wise person. And if that meteor lands on top of your house, that's the end of you. It doesn't make you bulletproof. Bad luck will wipe you out. So we do have to have a certain component of luck to attain well-being. Plato is very clear, though, that it requires surprisingly little if you understand well-being properly. It requires surprisingly little luck. Surprisingly little external equipment is necessary for attaining well-being, such that somebody like Socrates, who lived a life of voluntary poverty, was a superbly happy person, whereas people who had much more equipment, external things, were very unhappy. So it requires very little, but you still have to have external things, and these external things are in part furnished by simple circumstance, fate, luck, whatever. But the hallmark of being a fool is depending upon luck and not making provision to try and take as much control as you possibly can in your life. There's a crack, the lottery. It's just a tax on fools, because people who play the lottery are depending on luck. And, well, it's not harmful, I suppose, if you occasionally put $1 down for the $100 million Powerball jackpot. But the fact of the matter is that when you look at it, it is rather irrational that people would be better off if you're making an objective or rational calculation of risks, taking that dollar and buying lightning insurance than they would buying that lottery ticket. But the fact is that they want that money and they don't want to be hit by lightning, so they're going to spend it on the lottery ticket instead. That's just the way human beings are. And there are certainly people who are prize fools and spend all their earnings on lottery tickets. Depending upon luck, just hoping that you're going to have what they call dumb luck or end up in a fool's paradise really is a sign of folly. And the extent to which one is wise is the extent to which one tries to take as much control as possible over one's existence and push back the empire of fortune and its control over one's life. Socrates also makes a number of claims that sound very, very sort of Pollyanna-ish and optimistic and silly, like number 10. All human beings intend the good. No one intentionally does evil. Now, this is hard to swallow. Is it really the case that Jeffrey Dahmer was intending to do good? Isn't it the case that there are examples of human beings who seem to be sort of demonically evil, sort of Iago types who know it's good and just want to trample upon it precisely because it's good? Isn't that the case? Well, Socrates says no. All human beings intend the good. What explains all the evil in the world? Well, because although we're searching for the good and intend to do the good, we're often, in fact, we're almost always mistaken about what the good really is. So, the very structure of human action is always directed towards the good. Given any set of options that you have, human beings will try and choose the best option as they see it. So Jeffrey Dahmer could have stayed home and watched TV. He could have visited a sick friend. He could have gone to the library or gone to the movies. But of all the options available, he chose to lure people back to his apartment, kill them, and eat them. Why is that? Because he thought that was in some way the best use of his time. Now, he was terribly mistaken about that. This is why this proviso, we always choose the good as we see it, is so important. Because the fact is that we see things often wrongly. We're often quite deluded about what we see as good, but we still choose that thing that we see to be the best. Those people who say, I know it's good, but I just don't want to do it. I know it's good to give money to charity, but I just want to spend it on beer. I've heard people say that. And my response to that is, well, what you're really saying is this. I know that people say it's quote-unquote good to give money to charity, but I don't really believe that. Because if you really believed it, you wouldn't be just spending it on self-indulgence. A lot of people will say that they know certain things that they really don't know in the sense that they wholeheartedly believe to be true. But Socrates says, if you know something to be good, you will do it. If you're mistaken about that thing, you'll do something that's not good. But you'll do an evil thing only under the guise of the good. We only do evil, he says, out of ignorance of the good. This is an enormously important claim. It's controversial. We'll have plenty of opportunity to kick it around and debate it. We'll look at Aristotle's critique of this. And I'll try and show you that Aristotle ultimately gives in to Socrates, even though he tries to criticize him. Number 12 and 13 are just different versions of that. Number 11, evil action happens only out of ignorance of the good, and virtue is knowledge of the good, vice is ignorance of the good. When we talk about a virtuous person or an excellent person, we're simply saying that they have a certain amount of knowledge of the good. We're talking about vicious people. We're talking about people who are somehow systematically deluded about where the good, their own good lies. Let's go to number 14. The soul is susceptible of structural and dynamic analysis. Well, what does that mean? Well, structural analysis means you can break something down into its parts, and dynamic analysis means that it has certain forces that expend themselves or express themselves in time. And you can look at those forces over time as well as sort of timeless structures. It's sort of cross-section, if you will, of the soul. Now, 15 is the structural analysis, if you will. The soul has parts, and he calls them reason, spirit, and desire. And these parts can function together in harmony, which is what we call spiritual health. and in disharmony, which is spiritual disease. So there are parts of the soul, we'll go into that in much more detail later. And the parts can function together harmoniously or disharmoniously in a way that's strictly analogous to the parts of the body. The parts of the body, the limbs and organs and tissues of the body are differentiated, yet they can function together in a harmonious or in a disharmonious way. We call the harmonious functioning of the parts of the body health, and disharmony in the parts illness. 16. The soul also has a dynamic power, and Plato calls this eros, or love. He has many descriptions of this. We'll look at a couple passages from the Symposium where he describes this for next time. But eros is the soul's longing for growth towards the good. It's a longing for completion, for self-actualization, and ultimately he's going to argue for immortality. The soul not only wants to have the good, its own good, but it wants to have it forever. This is the inner meaning of love for Plato. And eros is the desire for the good of the soul, which is aroused by the beauty of the body. So beauty, and physical beauty in particular, arouses eros, but ultimately what it's directed towards is something beyond the beautiful and beyond the physical, which is the good of the soul, not of the body. 17. Each part of the soul has its appropriate erotic object, knowledge, ideals, the necessities of life, or different objects of the parts of the soul. So the rational part of the soul has an erotic longing, if you will, for knowledge. And when it knows, it feels complete and satisfied. The desires of the soul have an erotic need for what Plato would call the necessities of life. These are the things that make desire feel completed, and so on. The spirited part of the soul longs for the ideal and feels complete when it possesses ideals or pursues them. Now, number 18 is important. Wisdom produces the inner harmony of the parts of the soul and guides them to their completion. So wisdom introduces a proper ordering of the parts of the soul, statically, if you will, and also guides this sort of ongoing process of self-actualization to its conclusion. This is the proper role of wisdom in relationship to happiness. And when you get to this state of both self-actualization and inner harmony, what you have achieved is happiness, well-being, which is what we're all searching for. Now, philosophy is the pursuit of wisdom. It literally means love of wisdom, and love has to be understood as pursuing it, not necessarily having it. And the philosophy as the pursuit of wisdom is equivalent for Plato, therefore, to the care of the soul, the guiding of the soul to its proper end, the introduction of the proper harmony of its parts. So philosophy as the pursuit of wisdom is the care of the soul, or the pursuit of happiness, if you will. And this is why philosophy is important. Plato argues we're all pursuing happiness. And philosophy is that thing without which we cannot reliably gain the happiness we seek. Now, we can hope to luck out, but it's foolish to depend entirely upon luck. Therefore, we have to deliberately pursue wisdom as a way of taking greater control over this process. And we're already in the process, and we always already want that goal. So what Plato makes clear is what's necessary to achieve the goal, wisdom. And that's what philosophy is pursuing. So we should all be pursuing philosophy. It's a very simple argument.